One. Welcome back into the Pick and Roll NBA podcast with Jet and Sap, presented by Full Press Coverage. Sap, we're going to do a Celtic-centric show today, just getting an update on the local team here because we are both in Boston, and I know a lot of our listeners are Celtics fans, so perennially we like to check in on the green team, and there's been actually stuff going on with them. A slow start to the offseason, but since then it's picked up, and they're in the stage now where they're handing out extensions. They've extended Marcus Smart, they've extended Robert Williams, and just as of yesterday extended new acquisition Josh Richardson, who hasn't even played a game for them yet. Sap, do any of these extensions surprise you?
In a sense, yeah, because it looked like the Celtics were going cheap, right? And what we heard a month ago, or even more recently, is that they wanted to get all of these expiring contracts so that they could be a big player in free agency next summer. Instead, they extend Marcus Smart 4 years, $77 million. Robert Williams III, they extend 4 years, $54 million. And Josh Richardson, 2 years, $24 million, which comes to $45 million per year for those three players, at a grand total of $155 million committed to those three players. And I think in the sense of Smart and Richardson, aren't those two players somewhat alike? Do you need both of them? I mean, you don't normally need like two Jackie Bradley Juniors in the outfield. You maybe can carry one. Why do you need two of the same player like Marcus Smart and Josh Richardson? So I find that kind of strange. Robert Williams III, we both agree, has a tremendous amount of upside. But in his first 3 years in the league, Jet, the Celtics have played 230 games. He's played in 113 of them. He's about as reliable as Joel Embiid as far as actually playing, although Embiid, a lot of his misses came in this first few years when he didn't play at all. So you're getting Marcus Smart, who I know you love and I don't. You get Robert Williams III, who does have a high upside, but is not reliable at all. And Josh Richardson, who seems to me to be a lot like Marcus Smart. So a lot of money tied up into these three players. And now they lose some of that flexibility that we heard about going into next offseason when, in theory, they can go after Bradley Beal. Now, you know the mechanisms of contracts and what's better to do something like that. Is it better to have expiring contracts to maybe get into play for Bradley Beal, or is it better to have players that are committed for 4 years that maybe you can flip for Bradley Beal? And do you think Marcus Smart, Robert Williams III, and Josh Richardson, or some combination of draft picks or draft swaps, could net them Bradley Beal next summer or during the season?
Here's I've had some time to sort of like ruminate and look at the cap ramifications and stuff like that. And on the surface, it looks like, well, they've gotten rid of all their flexibility financially. I can't pursue free agents now because they have money tied up with these guys. But if you actually sort of look into it and how much money is committed, like you said, the numbers pretty much exactly match what a max contract would be.
Mhm.
So I look at it this way, Sap, as if Bradley Beal or whoever wants to come to Boston, that's the hardest part, is convincing somebody, a star level player, to want to come specifically to Boston. The easy part is being able to move those contracts and make it work. Whether it's a sign and trade, whether it's you're dumping those contracts on a team that has cap room, and you send in like a sweetener to them and to sort of absorb cap space from them. I think it makes sense for them to have these deals on the books that are, none of them are outrageous. I think they're all pretty reasonably priced. All these players are on the young side, so you're paying for the best years, presumably, of their career. And I think that because of that, they're all movable deals. So I look at it as next offseason, and we can talk about this down the road further, the fit potentially of Bradley Beal, Jason Tatum, and Jaylen Brown, which I'm not necessarily a big fan of, but let's say that is the plan. I think that Bradley Beal becoming a free agent and saying, Boston, that's where I want to go, I think that's the hardest part. So if I don't think that the contracts are really the big hurdle to get over to get Bradley Beal here. I think it's ultimately him becoming a free agent, one, and then saying, yeah, Boston, that's where I want to go, two. Those are the two hardest things. So what they've done is created a situation where okay, they have these movable contracts. Should Bradley Beal say, I want to come, or whoever, I want to come to Boston specifically, I think they can move those contracts. And two, they've created a situation where they do have, if there's, their backup plan C or D or whatever you want to call it, worst case scenario, they do have these guys under contract and they're not going to lose them for nothing, a la Gordon Hayward and Kyrie Irving. And I know none of these players are the caliber of those guys, but I think that Brad Stevens has learned a little bit from Danny Ainge's mistakes and said, I'm not going to just let guys walk and get absolutely nothing in return for them.
Is it an overcorrection though when you start to do, and again, this is the way the NBA works, it's generally 4-year contracts, right? Especially for players like Marcus Smart, Robert Williams III. I mean, you can sign them to something else, but that's kind of the going rate. Even the great players generally sign for 4, maybe 5 years. I mean, we saw, I believe Luka Doncic signed a 5 years extension, Steph Curry a 4-year extension. That's what the players sign. You don't see Mike Trout or Mookie Betts type 8, 10, 12-year contracts in the NBA because players want flexibility. After 3 or 4 years, they may want to go elsewhere. We've seen it with Kevin Durant. We've seen it with LeBron James. The two best players in the sport have both been able to move after a 4-year period with a specific team. In the case of Kevin Durant, a 3-year stay in Golden State, he said, I'm moving on. Now, I know with these 3 players, you can't trade them for 6 months, or at least I think Smart and Robert Williams III, you can't trade for 6 months. Could it be in play that they take these players and move them at the trade deadline for Bradley Beal so that Washington's getting these guys, and also you get Bradley Beal into the system in February and hope that he's impressed playing with his best friend Jason Tatum and likes playing with Jaylen Brown and is impressed with Ime Udoka, the new head coach of the Celtics? Is that something that could happen, or do you just have to wait till the offseason and just pray that Bradley Beal wants to come to the Boston Celtics?
Yeah, I think it's all a matter of, what the situation is in Washington. If Bradley Beal really wants out and Washington sees the writing on the wall and says, okay, we have no chance of re-signing this guy, then I think certainly they're going to look to trade him at the trade deadline. But I don't know necessarily what they'd want in return. I would think young players and picks seems most likely. The Celtics can offer that because they do have all their own picks. And they do have, some interesting young players. Robert Williams is still young. Marcus Smart is still on the young side too. And so that with those things, the money works. And then you send in a guy like Aaron Nesmith who has some, upside and a bunch of draft picks. So that could certainly work potentially. Or if, Washington thinks they have a good chance of him re-signing a free agency, then you see what happens and they roll the dice, and the Celtics then wait and see if Bradley Beal wants to just sign outright in Boston. And if that's the case, then you just make the money work via sign and trade, or you dump some of the contracts on a team that has cap space, like Oklahoma City, who is perennially has cap space. So, I think there's a bunch of ways to make it work. And as far as Bradley Beal coming in potentially at the middle of the season, I don't think the Celtics would do that unless they felt very comfortable that he would re-sign. I think Brad Stevens is pretty cautious as a person, and I think that sometimes that works as a GM too. You don't want to be overly cautious, but you don't want to completely get burned. And so I don't think he would make a deal for Bradley Beal in the middle of the year unless he had it, either verbal commitment from Bradley Beal that, yeah, I'm going to sign there in the off season. I'll extend with you guys. So I think those are the scenarios. And again, we could talk about this, later down the line, Sap. I'm not a big fan of the fit, so I'm not necessarily sure that is in fact where they have their eyes set. I mean, it seems logical because the connection between Tatum and Beal as best friends, and Beal is going to be a free agent this upcoming offseason. But you never know who shakes loose in the NBA in terms of disgruntled players or teams wanting to start fresh. So I don't love the fit of Beal, so maybe they have their eyes on somebody else. I think Towns would be a much better fit.
I'm with you on this, Jed.
I have no idea if he's available, but I could see them looking at him and saying, maybe we can cajole the Timberwolves into making a deal.
And real quickly, I know you want to move on, but if Bradley Beal comes here with Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, now you have 3 score-first guys. You don't have a natural facilitator. I think Tatum could kind of morph into that a little bit and still put up 25 points per game, but you could run the offense through him because I think out of the three, he's the best passer, the best facilitator. But you're right. I don't know if that's necessarily the best fit. And sometimes when best friends get together, they're no longer best friends. I can speak from experience that sometimes it's not the best idea to become roommates with your best friend, because after about a year, you get on each other's nerves. And you know what happens? One splits and you're no longer best friends. Dwayne Wade and LeBron James got together in Miami and they remain friends. I think they were also a little bit more mature at this point than, say, Tatum and Brown were, or if you want to put Beal into that conversation. But it didn't work right from the get-go. Remember, the Heat got off to a 9-8 start. They made it to the finals that year and lost to a Dallas team that, quite frankly, they should have beat in 5 or 6 games max. It didn't work out the first year. It did work in years 2 and 3. But we're also talking about all-time talent there on LeBron James and Dwayne Wade as compared to Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, and Bradley Beal. So I agree with you. I don't know if that's necessarily the best fit, because now you've got 3 scorers. And if Tatum and Beal form a clique, now does Brown feel left out? You know, there could be some problems with that. I think it all falls on the new head coach, Ime Udoka. He's going to be the guy that has to make this all work together. But again, we've got plenty of time to talk about that, because I'm sure it's going to be at the forefront throughout the entire season.
Yeah, I mean, Bradley Beal is going to be, monitored by a lot of teams, and we've heard Golden State is really interested in him. As are the 76ers. You know, there's certainly teams that have good packages to put forward for Beal should he become available. You know, the thing that the Celtics would have to do in order to acquire any superstar via a trade is what we've seen the past couple of years, like the James Harden trade, where you just have to offer a ton of picks. Fortunately for the Celtics, they do have all their own picks. So, you can offer a lot. It just depends on if you feel like, okay, this is the move that puts us over the top. We're willing to give, picks for the next 4, 5, 6 years in order to acquire him. Danny Ainge, we saw, wasn't willing to do that because he thought he could knock every pick out of the park. We'll see if Brad Stevens is a little bit more pragmatic and says, maybe let's go for the win now. We have these young guys. It's not like these picks really matter to us in the near future anyways. So we'll see. But it does seem like the going rate for a star player is a lot of draft picks and pick swaps, which frankly, at this point, if I'm the Celtics, I'm fine with giving up because, you're trying to win now. You have your guys in place in Tatum and Brown. And if you can get a third guy here and start to really be in the mix for a championship, I think it's well worth it to not have picks for the next, 4 or 5 years. Who cares? Let the other teams figure that out. So we'll see what happens. And, hopefully for the Celtics and Celtics fans, they're able to get some excitement either around the trade deadline or next off season in terms of potentially having a big 3. I mean, I'm not trying to dump on Bradley Beal. I just don't love the fit, but it certainly would make them a lot more relevant with 3 guys as opposed to just 2 guys. So we'll see. We'll have to see what happens. And as far as those contract extensions, Sap, go, I don't think any of them are bad deals for the team. It does seem odd that they are, suddenly handing out these extensions, but I think all of them are pretty reasonable money in terms of what guys are going for. I don't look at any of those guys as overpaid. At the top of the show, you mentioned Spartan Richardson maybe a little bit redundant. I think that they view Richardson more as a 3-and-D wing off the bench and Smart as just the primary ball handler. Whether either of the guys are capable of that, we'll have to see. But I do think Richardson is kind of poised for a bounce back year because he's going to have a lot less put on his plate than he did initially in Dallas and he did the prior year in Philadelphia. And I think they'll put him in a more comfortable position. And Smart, we'll see, if he's up to the task of being the starting point guard. They said he's going to be the starting point guard. They have Dennis Schroeder waiting in the wings. Peyton Pritchard played really well this summer. So we'll have to see if Smart's up to it. But certainly in terms of his age and his defensive ability, if you look at the other contracts throughout the league, it does seem like Smart's being paid appropriately.
Yeah, I mean, this is the going rate in the NBA. My only issue is now Marcus Smart's your 3rd highest paid player, right? So in his mind, he's part of a big 3. He's your 3rd best player, and I don't think that bodes well for the Celtics. And as far as Robert Williams III, look, a guy's played less than half of the available games over the last 3 years. That's a concern. And Richardson, I know they talk about him being a 3-and-D guy. believe he shot 33% from three last year. That's not all that great, but maybe in a different situation, he'll be better. I know the Smart contract was one that kind of surprised me because I had the feeling that maybe they were going to move on from him, which they can next offseason. It's not a done deal that he's going to finish his career with the Boston Celtics. If he plays in Boston for the remainder of this contract, he will have spent 13 years in Boston, and there's only a handful of players that ever did that. You know, Bill Russell, John Havlicek, Sat Sanders, Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, Robert Parrish, and Paul Pierce. And then you'd put Marcus Smart in there, who doesn't really fit with those guys, although his skill set somewhat similar to Sat Sanders, but Sanders was on 8 championship teams. The contract that was also signed last week was Terry Rozier, 4 years, $97 million with the Charlotte Hornets. And I put out a poll a couple days ago. It didn't get a lot of responses, and it ended up being 50-50, which absolutely sucks when you put a poll on it's 50-50.
Right.
That's not what you want to see. But who would you prefer to have right now, Terry Rozier or Marcus Smart? And the thing is, they're the same age, and I get that Rozier's making about $5 million more per year. I know you're a huge Marcus Smart guy, but, you know, if it was a binary choice, Marcus Smart or Terry Rozier for the 2021-2022 Celtics, who would you prefer?
Smart, because I saw what Rozier is like, when he plays with these guys. I like Rozier. I think that his stats are super inflated playing on the Hornets. Sap. He's last season, good for him. He scored 20 points a game. The season before, 18 points a game. He's a better scorer than Marcus Smart. I can't deny that. But Marcus Smart's a way better defender, and I think Marcus Smart plays a better team game than Rozier. Rozier, I was excited to see go when they let him go. He has and sometimes you need this in the NBA. He has a much higher opinion of himself,
Sure,
to me than his actual game, and you
as
talk
does
about
Marcus Smart.
as does Marcus Smart.
Thing.
But you
right.
talk about guys, taking away shots from Tatum and Brown. And I think, and Smart certainly does that to some extent, but I think Rozier does it way, way more, and was the focal point of the Hornets offense the past couple of years, Sap. And I just think Smart's a better fit for a team where the Celtics are. And Rozier, had he been on a better team the past couple of years, I think either the numbers would have been down or it would have been a problem. So I like Smart better because of the defense and because I just think he's a better overall fit.
I would go with Rozier simply because the last 2 years in Charlotte, he's developed into a 40% three-point shooter, which I think is something that the Celtics can always use. Marcus Smart is closer to a 30% three-point shooter. That's a huge difference. Again, I'm not a big fan of either player because they both have inflated opinions of themselves, which, like you said, in the NBA, you have to. But I think you also have to be self-aware and a realist at times to know that, okay, I'm this guy on this team. And Rozier had a really nice year last year. Charlotte was on the outskirts of making the playoffs. They were in that play-in tournament. He had a nice year. And I think that maybe he's matured as a player. Neither, to me, are going to be guys that put you over the top. I think they're more role players who are now being compensated as guys they're going to have to step up a bit more. So, yeah, I know you're a huge Smart guy, and I'm hoping that the Celtics move on from Marcus Smart at some point, if it is, of course, in part of getting a third star here, which I think they need. But that's going to be the discussion all season long, without question.
Yeah, and obviously the thing that sticks out like a sore thumb is that they traded. It was essentially Kemba Walker for Terry Rozier, and everybody thought it was a heist, and the Hornets ended up winning that deal.
Right. Yeah.
Shockingly, Rozier at this point is a more reliable player than Kemba Walker. Because he's more available and, they're scoring about the same amount of points a game. The Hornets somehow won that. They got the younger, more reliable player who does about the same production. I don't really think you can knock Danny Ainge for that. And I like to knock Danny Ainge for a lot of things, but the Celtics just got incredibly unlucky with Walker completely breaking down. And Rozier, to his credit, has earned that money by, stepping up in a starting role, which is what he wanted. He didn't want to be the sixth man, and really excelling in that role. Now, as the Hornets build more around LaMelo Ball and try to get to be a better team, and if Gordon Hayward plays more, will Terry Rozier be okay being less of a factor on offense? We'll have to see. But, right now, I think it's a great situation for him. They don't have very high expectations. He can take all the shots he wants. And so it's a good situation for Rozier and the Hornets. I think he's a little overpaid, but if you're Charlotte, This is the same thing with I said with the Gordon Hayward thing. Why not? No one's usually coming there in free agency. So if you have to
Mhm.
shell out a little extra money to keep a guy who's an above average player, which Rozier is, which Hayward is, I do it. I have no problem with Charlotte overpaying players. If that's the way they get better, then that's the way they get better. It's not like it hurts the Celtics or the Lakers a lot more to overpay players because they're usually players in free agency than the Hornets who aren't. So they might as well do it.
Yeah, I mean, if you're willing to play in Charlotte, so be it. And it's also a market that there's not a ton of pressure because you have two college teams in that state that draw much more attention. Of course, North Carolina and Duke. Charlotte is the third most popular team in North Carolina. Maybe, I don't know,
Maybe
maybe NC
fourth.
Charlotte is even more popular.
Well, Wake
So
Forest is there too.
Wake Forest
So
could be there too. Yeah, Tim Duncan and Chris Paul both played at Wake Forest. So yeah, you can make a case that playing for the Charlotte Hornets, it's almost like playing for the Cincinnati Bengals, right? You've got Ohio State is much bigger than the
right.
Cincinnati Bengals and the Buckeye State, and also the high school programs in Ohio are enormous. Danny Ross, who played for Everett High, a graduate of Everett High, unfortunately passed away at a very young age. He played for the Cincinnati Bengals, and I had him on a show one time. He said, "I'm playing on the Cincinnati Bengals. We're like page 6 or 7 of the sports section. The Buckeyes get the front page, then the high schools get the next 3 pages, and then we somehow show up later on in the sports page." But if you don't like pressure and you can go ahead and make almost $25 million a year, average 20 points per game, have a nice career, and it's not a bad place to go.
Yeah, and you get to hang out with Michael Jordan on occasion, so that's pretty cool
Yeah,
too.
absolutely.
Um, yeah, I think he practices with the team sometimes. That's intimidating.
Probably their best player still.
He might be. He very well
Yeah.
might be. Well, let's move on to some more Celtics news, but some older Celtics players. No one currently on the team. Kevin Garnett, we knew he was going to have his number retired. They announced that a couple of years ago. Now we have an official date as to when he's going to have his number retired. That is going to be March 13th against the Dallas Mavericks. I don't know why they picked that game in particular, but I guess why not? Probably just worked with Kevin Garnett's schedule. I think it's a no-brainer to retire his number. I did see some pushback on social media. Some people saying, he didn't play enough for the team, didn't play enough, as many games as needed. But to me, I thought this was never in doubt. Do you have a problem with him retiring his number, Sap?
No, he changed the culture here, and I know that's an overused term. I get that, and I think Kevin Garnett in the city is somewhat overrated. I still remember Game 7 of the 2010 Finals when they didn't have Kendrick Perkins, and Kevin Garnett went out and got 1, 2, 3 rebounds in that game. Meanwhile, Kobe Bryant got 14 rebounds, and it was just a slugfest. Celtics lost by 5. I believe it was 83-78, an ugly game. And Garnett wasn't as big a factor as he probably hoped he was going to be or should have been. Garnett's an all-time great player without question. I have him in my top 25 all time. Sensational player. We know what he meant to the Celtics. He kind of became, when he got here, was the alpha male, to say the least, because Paul Pierce was never really that guy, and certainly Ray Allen wasn't that guy when he got here. So I think that Garnett was the leader of that team without question. So sure, absolutely retire his number. Dennis Johnson, who played 7 years here, won 2 championships, had his number retired. You can make a case that Garnett had at least as much an impact as Dennis Johnson had on the Celtics. I mean, when Dennis Johnson came to the Celtics, they were already a ready-made championship team. They had Bird, McHale, and Parrish. He became the 4th guy on that team. When Garnett came here, they were a sad sack. And by him coming here and also Ray Allen coming here, they won a championship in their first year together. So yeah, absolutely. They retire everybody's number for the Celtics. So why not Kevin Garnett? We know it's never going to be Ray Allen's number being retired. Nope. That's for sure. And we know Ray Allen's not going to be at the ceremony when Garnett's number is retired, to say the least, because he put out an IG post where he cropped out Ray Allen's picture, because there was a picture of Garnett, Rondo, Pierce, and Allen from back in the day, and then he, cropped out Ray Allen. So obviously Ray Allen is persona non grata when it comes to Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett, and Rajon Rondo. So be it. But I kind of wish it was against the Lakers, right? Because LeBron would be in the building, and both Garnett and Paul Pierce continue to troll LeBron, who has 4 championships. They each have one, and they keep talking about how LeBron had to leave Cleveland to beat them and yada, yada, yada. And of course, we know LeBron, I believe, is 6-2 against the Celtics in his career in playoff series. But yeah, he obviously deserves to have his number retired. He's an all-time great. He'll be on the NBA's 75th anniversary team. They're going to release that in October, the 75 greatest players in NBA history. Obviously, Kevin Garnett's going to be in that. Back in 1997, they had the top 50 players in league history. So you're going to have to find 25 players who played in the league slightly before that and then after that to fill out that 75. Maybe they'll even bring in some of the older players that they didn't have, or maybe they'll eliminate some of the older players that are on that
they
list.
very well might bump some guys.
They could do that. Like I know Dave Bing, and I'm not dumping on Dave Bing. Dave Bing's an all-time great player, but a player like Dave Bing, who was kind of a borderline choice on that list, he may fall by the wayside to add a player from this era. That's a whole other discussion. I'm sure we'll get into that when that's released. We'll probably do 7 podcasts on that. Now, the only thing is they're not going to put that list out in order. They'll just put it out in alphabetical order, because that would be more fun if they did it like the NFL Network is doing their top 100 players. That would be quite the countdown. And it would be Jordan 1, LeBron 2, like it is on most everyone else's list, except, like Skip Bayless and Paul Pierce, who apparently doesn't think LeBron should be in the top 5 if he doesn't win a title with the Lakers. But yeah, Garnett deserves to have that number retired. It should be interesting. It's against Dallas, which is kind of weird. It's not even an Eastern Conference rival, like you said. It's again, maybe it just has to do with scheduling.
Right. I think that's probably it. Garnett lives in Malibu. He does a lot of TV stuff and doing a lot of, he has a lot of business interests now. So maybe it was the only time that really worked for him.
Right.
I don't know. But yeah, obviously, if you could pick an opponent to do it against, you'd preferably do it against the Lakers, because, he played in 2 finals here. They're both against the Lakers, Celtics, Lakers, the LeBron factor. That makes more sense, but it is what it is. And that game also might be, I'm assuming, probably on national TV, and so the retirement ceremony takes a while, so they probably couldn't do it because they can't extend the game due to commercials. I don't know how this sort of stuff works.
Well, when they did it last time for Pierce, and I was at that game, they were playing Cleveland, and LeBron and the Cavaliers lit up the Celtics in that game. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I think they did the ceremony after the game. Because I remember
they did it after the game.
The game was over, and then we just stuck around, and Pierce came and talked to everybody. And I got to interview Doc Rivers before the game because he was in town. And I'm sure if Doc can make it, he'll make it in. Maybe they could have done it against Philadelphia, but I think it all depends on what Garnett's schedule was or is, and that's why they're doing it against Dallas on March 13th. So no, he certainly deserves to have his number retired. 6 years here, 2 finals appearances, a championship, and the fans loved him. The fans love Paul Pierce, but you can't find really one Celtic fan that has anything bad to say about Kevin Garnett. They just love the guy.
Well, he sort of embraced the city right away.
Oh, yeah.
And the culture of the team. And I think he's the type of player that if you have him on your team, you love him. And if you're playing against him, you hate him. And he drove me crazy in Minnesota because of the intensity and stuff like that. You're like, this guy is really annoying. But then when he's on your team, you're like, oh, I get it. He's doing everything he can to win a basketball game. And I think, people love that. And they saw the sort of like Larry Bird, Dave Cowan's like maniacal like effort sort of thing, and it resonated with the city of Boston. And he's only had amazing things to say about Boston and the Celtics organization. And I think, frankly, the Celtics need that, especially with this whole racial awakening, which is unfair to the Celtics because they've been on the forefront of race relations, but you have guys like Kyrie Irving who've tried to burn down the city and the organization and stuff like that. And so having Garnett as a spokesperson for how great the team is, how great the city is, I think is really advantageous for the Celtics. And the fact that his relationship with Minnesota and the Timberwolves has deteriorated so much to the point where he doesn't even want his number retired there. And he basically identifies as just a Celtic, even though he was in Minnesota far longer, I think is to the Celtics, advantage. So to have Garnett singing the praises of Boston, I think really helps. And, retiring his jersey makes sense on a basketball level, but I think it also makes sense on a PR level too. Have him talk to players, have him talk nationally about his time in Boston and how important it was to him. That just makes the organization look really good. So yeah, it's a no-brainer on multiple fronts. I'm hopefully going to be there. I'd like to go to that game because I'd like to see him get his number retired. And yeah, it makes sense. And also, yeah, I'm all for him cropping Ray Allen out of his Instagram picture. Listen, people are going to call him petty, and maybe he's a little bit petty, and that's why he succeeded in some regards in the NBA. But the Ray Allen thing, Ray Allen's had chances to have made amends, and he's chosen really not to. So it's not a complete one-way street here. Ray Allen skipped Paul Pierce's retirement ceremony to go golfing, and he's inducting Chris Bosh into the Hall of Fame. There's all this stuff where I don't think that Ray Allen really cares one way or the other.
No.
So he's not going to get his number retired here. He was the third fiddle on the big three, and so you could certainly make a case he could have his number retired here, but no one wants to see him get his number retired here. And you don't retire a number of a player that fans don't like. That doesn't make any sense. It's not the WWE where you're trying to get, like heat on bad guys or heels. That doesn't help the Celtics at all. So number 20 will stay around Boston, and Ray Allen will just have to settle for getting his number retired in Milwaukee or Seattle when they get a team back, or maybe the Heat do it to troll the Celtics. I don't know.
Or maybe LeBron will just retire the number on his own.
Maybe
with the Portland Trailblazers when he buys them in a decade. But
yeah, by the way, Sap, LeBron's going to get his number retired in LA, I assume, and he's going to have played probably the same amount of games in LA as Garnett ended up playing in Boston.
Oh yeah, without question. Yeah, I mean the Lakers retire a lot of numbers as well, and you could make a case that I don't want to get into discussion like which is the more decorated franchise. They both have 17 titles. The Lakers have gone to more finals than the Celtics.
Well, but not if the LA Lakers haven't.
Right, but they're the Lakers. They were in Minneapolis and they won 5 titles there. So I mean, whatever. But if you want to get into the debate like who's won more since the merger, it's the Celtics have won 4 and the Lakers have won 11 since the merger. Whatever. But the Lakers, I think, have a deeper bench than the Celtics in terms of historical figures, because it seems like everybody at some point played with the Lakers. A lot of players played with the Celtics. It's just like you forget that Bob McAdoo played for the Lakers. Obviously, both teams. He did. He played for both teams. Even Dwight Howard is in his 3rd stay with the Lakers. It seems like everybody shows up at that point. But yeah, I mean, this just speaks to the greatness of Bill Russell, though, because he was beating Laker teams in the finals that quite frankly had better high-end talent than the Celtics had. I mean, he beat the Lakers twice with Chamberlain, West, and Baylor. Like, that's ridiculous. Talk about the ultimate big three, beat him twice. So that speaks a lot about Bill Russell, that, he was kind of the Tom Brady of the Celtics at that point. It was like he was the common denominator, maybe not Red Auerbach or the other players who were all great, but not at the level of Bill Russell. But yeah, it's gonna be an interesting day to see. And if you go to the game, you get to see Luka, which that's pretty good too.
Yeah, it'll be a hot ticket for sure between the seeing Luka and Garnett getting his number retired. I'm sure it won't be cheap, so I might have to call in some favors or something like that. But I mean, he deserves it. I don't think anybody should question it. I don't think people should question Ray Allen not getting his number retired too. He didn't have. Listen, he was excellent while he was here. He didn't have the same impact as Kevin Garnett, period. No. And so if you're questioning Garnett getting his number retired, which I don't think you should, then you certainly wouldn't think Ray Allen should get his number retired. And Ray Allen hasn't done anything to ingratiate himself to the city or to the team since his time here ended badly. And part of getting your number retired and being an all-time great on a team is being popular. And Garnett remains as popular as ever, 10 years after his playing career ended, Sep, with the Celtics. And Ray Allen remains reviled. So that's how it will go. It's not going to happen. I'd say Rondo was more likely to get his number retired with the Celtics than Ray Allen, and I don't think Rondo's going to get his number retired here, nor should he. It doesn't really make any sense.
No, when does it end? Do you retire Kendrick Perkins' number? Eddie House. I mean, no, you can't retire everybody's number. I get it. So yeah, I think obviously the right thing to do to retire Kevin Garnett's number.
Yeah, so that will happen. That'll be a nice day for the Celtics again. It's always good to have Garnett saying nice things about the Celtics, and Pierce will be there certainly. As Garnett's inducting Pierce in the Hall of Fame, they remain very, very close friends. I'm sure plenty of ex-Celtics will be back. Perk will obviously be there as he works part-time for the team anyways. So it'll be a good day for Celtics fans, Sap. Did you want to talk about? I know you mentioned Paul Pierce trolling
Oh, of
LeBron.
course.
Is that
Absolutely.
really getting your goat? Is that
No,
upsetting
no, no.
you?
I find it kind of comical. Garnett and Pierce come across to me as like the angry old guys, like, get off my lawn. Like they're, and I also push back a little bit that the Celtics won a championship with these two guys, and it seems out of the 17 championships the Celtics won, this is the one that everybody talks about. I get that it's the most recent, it's the only one in 35 years, and you have to be at least 40 years old to remember any other championship. I get that, but it seems like the 07-08 Celtics are like the most popular team in the history of the franchise that won 16 titles before that. And I think if you look at their 6 years together, Garnett and Pierce, you could make a case that they underachieved. Yes, they won a championship in their first year, but then they lost to the Lakers 2 years later. In between, they had lost to Orlando in the Eastern Conference Finals after leading 3-2. So I think they get somewhat overrated at some point. I remember we had this discussion last year when Paul Pierce was claiming he had a better career than Dwayne Wade, which is, ludicrous. And now he's coming out with the statement that if LeBron doesn't win with this Lakers team, he's not a top 5 player. Like, okay, that's fine. Paul Pierce wants to troll LeBron James. This kind of has a feel of like John Hamm trolling Daniel Day-Lewis. Like Paul Pierce, excellent player, great player, probably going to be in the top 75 all-time greatest
Yeah, he
players.
will. Mm-hmm.
He'll be on there. If you're going to put it in numerical order, he's probably in the low 70s, which is great. I mean, nothing wrong with being the 70th greatest player in the history of a sport that's been played for 75 years. But he's trolling who I think is the greatest player, or certainly one of the 4 players in the discussion of the greatest players of all time. Like if LeBron, what he's done already kind of puts him in that situation. Now, to call this Laker team a super team, we can have that discussion. Russell Westbrook, I think, is past his prime and not really a good fit with this team. Dwight Howard and Carmelo Anthony are along for the ride. So it's not a super team per se. I think the only super team in the NBA is in Brooklyn, where you have 3 guys who are right in their prime, essentially, in Durant, Harden, and Kyrie Irving. So it's a little bit different. Like if the Lakers lose in the Western Conference Finals, are we going to all have to get together and have a big moment and say, you know what, LeBron isn't one of the 5 greatest players of all time? Anybody that thinks that LeBron's not one of the 5 greatest players of all time is an idiot. I know Skip Bayless ranks him like 8th or 9th. That's absolutely idiotic. He's clearly one of, at least at the bare minimum, one of the 4 greatest players in the history of the sport. Most people think he's one of the 2 greatest players in the history of the sport, and some of us think he's the greatest player in the history of the sport. So you can have that discussion. Look, if you want to say that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or Bill Russell or Michael Jordan are the greatest players that ever played this game, I'll hear you out without question. I really don't think anybody else belongs in that discussion other than those 3 guys and LeBron James. Paul Pierce, look, is kind of become irrelevant. He was on ESPN. He fucked up, quite frankly. I couldn't care less what he did. He had, hookers rubbing his head. He was high, whatever.
Strippers, Sap, not hookers.
Strippers.
Come
That's
on.
right. I want to differentiate. That's for sure. Good luck to him. God bless him. I wish I was at that party playing cards, having strippers. I want to make sure I get that clear. Rubbing my head. He's, obviously getting high. Awesome. But you lose your job at ESPN because we know that ESPN is Disney, so they're not going to really go along with that. Like, what is Paul Pierce doing now? I know they're talking about Barstool. I'm not sure what he's doing, but again, he's pretty smart to know that, let me say something idiotic, and 2 other idiots up in the Northeast are going to talk about it. That being me and you.
Yeah, I know. I got that. I mean, obviously he's trolling. No one thinks that LeBron is. I mean, well, maybe Skip Bayless.
Skip Bayless is pretty much the only
he's not
one.
A top 5 player. I mean, I don't think Paul Pierce even believes that. He's just, he's trolling. So
yeah,
that's fine. And there's still a rivalry between those 2 guys, and Paul Pierce is a competitive guy, and I get he's saying that to get under LeBron's skin, but I don't think even he believes that. But Sap, Garnett, certainly you could, make the case Garnett and Pierce maybe underachieved a little bit here, but couldn't you also make the case that LeBron has underachieved and to an extent too?
Oh yeah, I do. I mean, I think there's 2 finals he should have won that he didn't. The finals against Dallas, they were clearly the better team. I mean, who was the second best player on the Mavericks after
Jason
Dirk
Terry.
Nowitzki? Yeah, I mean, JJ Barea. I mean, seriously, I mean, it was
Jason
a good
Terry.
team. Yeah, it was Jason Terry. I mean, I can make a case that the Mavericks in 2011 were one of the 3 weakest teams I've ever seen win a championship. And this is not knocking other teams. It's just that the 79 Supersonics, the '04 Pistons, and the 2011 Mavericks, and maybe you want to throw the Bucks in that just won the championship last month. Those are like the four teams that they needed some help along the way to win their
Yeah.
championships. And they don't measure up to the Jordan Bulls or the Bird Celtics or Magic Lakers. So yeah, that's one that he should have won, and I do believe he should have won in 2015, his first year back in Cleveland when they're up 2-1. He was playing at an incredibly high level, and he didn't finish the deal. So yeah, he should be 6-5 in the finals, but he still has 4 championships, and he's done it at 3 different locations, and in many cases without really a great supporting cast for the most part. The time in Cleveland. So yeah, you can make a case that he underachieved. I guess you could make a case that, any great player underachieved. The Celtics,
Except for Bill Russell, right?
Bill Russell, yeah. I mean, you can't really go there unless you really want to nitpick and say he should have won all 13 years he was in the league. Yeah, I mean, the Bird Celtics probably underachieved at some point, right? I mean, they were right there in '85. They probably could have won that series. I'm really parsing words here. The Lakers were really good. I mean, but they lost 2 out of 3 to the Lakers in the finals. So that means something, right? Yeah, you can make that case. I don't think Jordan's Bulls really underachieved when you win 6 in 8 years and you kind of work your way up to that. Like, okay, maybe they could have beat the Pistons in 1990 in Game 7 of the Eastern Conference Finals, but they lost that game by 20 points. It's not like it came down to one shot and they missed it. That was the Scottie Pippen migraine game. So, yeah, absolutely. LeBron should have more than 4 titles. I'm not debating that. He should have more. And look, if he had 6 at this point, then the debate would be strictly 2 guys. And in my opinion, the guy who I still think is the greatest player. And again, when I say greatest player, I'm looking at it purely as a basketball player. I'm not talking about everything else. Then LeBron, I think, with 6 titles would be the guy that would surpass Jordan because his resume is just better. But the titles do mean things. I get it. Yeah, no, you can make a case he underachieved, but I'd rather underachieve and have 4 titles than underachieve and have 1.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think anybody besides, the real trolls, like the biggest trolls would say that. I look at it as I think there's 3 finals that he should have won. Those 2 that you pointed out, and the one against the Spurs is last year in Miami. I think also he should have won because I don't think that Spurs team was all that great either. I mean, they were good, but we could debate that till the cows come home. It doesn't really matter.
The rest of his team was awful. Dwayne Wade looked spent. Chris Bosh looked spent. I don't know. He played fine in the finals in San Antonio. I just remember San Antonio hitting their threes, whether it be Danny Green or Patty Mills. It just seemed like whoever Coach Popovich put on the court became like a 45% 3-point shooter, and Kawhi played really well in that series. He was emerging as a star, and you still had, Duncan Ginobili and Parker, who were all, certainly on the back 9 of their career. Yeah, he could have won that series without question, but I think he would have needed Wade and Bosh to step up. But yeah, so then he'd have 7 titles. So even better. So we'll see. Again, his career's not over, but you can make a case that every team at some point underachieves. I mean, the Lakers probably should have won more than 3 with Kobe and Shaq. They should have never lost. Until that, once they started winning, they should have never lost.
Yeah.
If they could have just got along. I mean, who the hell was beating them? I mean, they even cracked the San Antonio code, right? Because they beat them several times in the postseason. I believe Shaq and Kobe were like 4-2 against the Spurs in the postseason. I mean, they matched up well with them and beat them more often than not.
Yeah, they should have never lost. You're right. They should have won at least.
Should have never lost.
2 more titles. Probably 3 more.
Right.
Equaling what the Bulls did.
They should have.
They just could not have. They couldn't get along. So
no, because they didn't have the pecking order. See, that's what makes the Bulls run amazing and kind of explains it. Is they had the perfect pecking order, right? It was Jordan, Pippen, and then all the other guys played specific roles, and they all played defense. You had Kobe and Shaq still not quite fully flushed out leaders at that point. Not that Shaq was ever a leader; he was just a great player.
Also 2 big personalities too.
2 huge personalities.
Pippen, I don't think gave a damn about being, in all the commercials. He wanted to make money, but I don't think he cared about the fame so much.
That's why the Lakers in the '80s worked. I mean, okay, let's not going to get into the debate who's the greater player historically. I think it's Kareem slightly over Magic, but Magic was the leader of that team because Kareem wasn't that guy. Kareem. And centers generally aren't leaders, and maybe that goes back to Shaq not being a great leader. but James Worthy was the third guy. And there were nights, Jet, in the playoffs where James Worthy was the best player on the floor. I mean, he was Finals MVP in '88. There were games against the Celtics in '85 and '87. They had no answer for him, but he was quite comfortable being the third guy. He knew it was Magic's team and it was Kareem's team, and he had a high-profile coach in Pat Riley. And James Worthy, like Scottie Pippen, was very happy being where he was. He did not think of himself as better than Magic, and Pippen did not think of himself better than Michael Jordan. Whereas I think Kobe and Shaq, it got to the point where, well, who's the top dog here? And that became
it's
a
a
problem.
daily pissing contest between.
Oh, absolutely. And two stubborn guys who, I'm sure had a lot of people in their circle that were chirping at them. No, you're the guy. No, you're the guy. And at some point, Phil Jackson wasn't able to handle that. And Phil Jackson never really had to deal with that with the Bulls, because it was, Michael, Scotty, and then let's go to whoever the third guy was, whether it was Horace Grant in the first three-peat or Dennis Rodman in the last three-peat, and then a bunch of other role players that, weren't going to step on Michael Jordan's toes.
Yeah, exactly. And then they made a mediocre trade for Shaq, where they should have gotten way more. Their centerpiece of that was Caron Butler, which, Caron Butler is a fine player, but you're trading Shaq. So, all right, Sap, I think that's going to do it for us at the Pick and Roll NBA podcast with Jet and Sap. We are presented by Full Press Coverage. That gives you sort of an update on what the Celtics are doing, what's going on, sort of Boston adjacent. We're going to come back with another podcast later in the week, talking about some of these over and unders that just got put out. So if you're better, you want to pay attention to that show. We can't promise anything, but we'll try to steer you in the right direction if you want to hit on some of those over and unders, and we'll tell you which ones are our favorites. So make sure you stay tuned to that. Thanks everybody for listening. If you want to see our Twitters and get all of those show updates, check out at John Sapp 25 at Jet Stryer. You can also find our podcast wherever podcasts are found, or on YouTube if you're not watching on YouTube already, youtube.com/Jet Stryer. Thanks everybody. We'll talk to you later. See ya.